This afternoon, we are indeed honored and privileged to have Dr. Reggie Williams with us. Dr. Williams is a lecturer in Christian ethics at Baylor University. He received his BA from Westmont College and earned his MA and PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary. His research focuses on the intersection of Christology, race, and social justice. We will be no doubt enriched, I think, this afternoon by Dr. Williams's treatment of the impact of the Harlem Renaissance, its literature and theology on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on Bonhoeffer's own theological reflection, and Bonhoeffer's own prophetic public resistance. Dr. Williams has titled his presentation this afternoon, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Harlem Renaissance and the Black Christ. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reggie Williams.
Thank you. Good, we're going. I felt like I was in church. I felt like I was at my home church, in fact. Thank you for that very warm welcome. I am indeed very glad to be here. And we have learned a lot over the past couple of days. I feel like I almost have nothing left to add to this very rich conversation. Let me make sure this thing is turned on here. As I get going here, let it be good to give a little bit of background. A question was posed to me before. How did you come by the Harlem Renaissance in Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Well, I got a little background for you in regards to that. When I started my graduate study years back, not many years, but when I started my graduate studies, I was intent on understanding or studying the ways in which our interpretation of Jesus, how does our understanding of Jesus shape our social ethics as Christians? I mean, for example, what kind of Christian would come from the interpretation of Jesus as the buddy Jesus? You know, God loves you. Or the homeboy Jesus. Or the Haight-Ashbury Jesus. What kind of interpretation or what kind of social ethics does that understanding of Jesus give us? When I got into my first year of my PhD program, my mentor at Fuller Seminary, Dr. Glenn Stassen, who's give him a plug right now for you to know about his book, Kingdom Ethics, out there with InterVarsity Press. Page 59, chapter 3. He's got a holistic character ethics model of ethical analysis. One of the constituents of that ethical analysis model is an interpretation of our theology. In the theological analysis, he has an understanding of Jesus. It says that people who understand Jesus without connecting him to justice will behave differently than Christians who understand Jesus connected to justice. Christians who understand Jesus without justice end up typically on the wrong side of really important like social issues, supporting harmful policies toward the poor and rejecting human rights and these kinds of things than Christians who do this, who understand Jesus' way as connected to justice. And then I was his TA in a class on Bonhoeffer. Back a little bit further than that, when I was doing my master's program, I took a class on theology and art. Did a term project on the Harlem Renaissance. Glenn's TA, years later, in a class on Bonhoeffer. Come to find out that he was in Harlem. The time he was in Harlem, in New York, corresponded with the Harlem Renaissance. I started digging, and this is a little bit of the information that I found that I wrote my dissertation on. Spring 1931 was the second semester of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year. Put a finger there. Let me finish that story, what I was just saying. That's the reason that this story helps me to tell the story of how one's interpretation of Christ is a social justice, can help to make a Christian who's social justice advocacy, who does social justice advocacy. So let me keep on going. Spring 31 was the second semester of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Sloan Fellowship year. That spring, he took a course with Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr entitled Ethical Viewpoints in Modern Literature. In his end-of-the-year summary to the Church Federation office in Germany, he described that course in the following way. In a lecture course by Dr. Niebuhr, the social and Christian problem was discussed in the context of modern American literature. That was extremely informative. I learned much from my own experiences in Harlem. That class was one in a collection of classes he took that spring in a course schedule that reflected an interest in a different engagement with theology than he had had in the fall. His altered course schedule was not the only change between his semesters. In the fall, he didn't have much positive to say about his academic experience at all. For example, in December of his fall semester, he wrote these words to his church superintendent about his experience in America thus far. Oops, too far ahead. There is no theology here. Although I am basically taking classes and lectures in dogmatics and philosophy of religion, the impression is overwhelmingly negative. They talk a blue streak without the slightest substantive foundation and with no evidence of any criteria. The students, on average, 25 to 30 years old, are completely clueless. But his description of his second semester courses was very different. The difference indicated a noticeable interest in the social performance of theology, in Christian ethics. It is a difference that I am arguing was in part influenced by the experiences he was having in Harlem, in which case his description of Niebuhr's class, along with the other very positive language he used to describe classes that semester with Ward and Weber, indicate a turning for Bonhoeffer that may tell us something of the personal significance of that time in New York for him and his Christian development. What was this learning he was referring to in Harlem? We may begin to discern an answer to that question by paying attention to what was going on in Harlem at the time of his Sloan Fellowship year. Bonhoeffer was a Sloan Fellow studying at Union Seminary during the Harlem Renaissance. That meant that all of his descriptions of his involvement in African American life, 1930-31, were occurring in this critical moment in African American history. He turned 24 years old in February of that school year. Thus, in addition to that time being very influential in the course of African American history, the young Bonhoeffer was also experiencing that critical moment while he was yet impressionable. This is one of the pictures, actually paintings, that Aaron Douglas, a very famous Harlem Renaissance artist, was commissioned to paint for the Schomburg, which is in Harlem. It describes the Harlem Renaissance. This particular one does. Over here, that's an African American in the throes of serfdom or racism and oppression here in the South. This is the racism and oppression reaching for an African American who's fleeing north on the cogwheel of industrialization. This one, here they've made it, and you see the towers here and the Statue of Liberty there. This is the Great Migration from the South to the North. In New York, the Harlem Renaissance consisted of the formation of a new Negro with regard to perspectives on politics and the economy, in addition to the creation of a culture that was to be a public declaration of an authentic black self-perception. It involved the migration of thousands of African Americans from rural spaces like southern farm fields or the Caribbean to urban and metropolitan areas. Harlem was the destination of choice. Consequently, the time period can also be understood as the urbanization of black life from the farm field to the factory, when old pejorative perceptions of black people were exchanged for the sophisticated, educated, cultured, urban black. Additionally, this self-perception worked to animate a seedling of a theology of civil disobedience. It was an interim moment with a nascent social theology, post-Civil War, pre-civil rights, that expressed the already present black definition of Christ the suffering servant for the reclaiming of African American humanity and self-worth. Yet during the Harlem Renaissance, this theology also included a theologically informed engagement with social expectations by reclaiming Christ in the face of human suffering as a movement. In the face of human suffering as a movement. The Harlem Renaissance is generally understood to involve at least two stages, beginning around the time of the First World War and lasting into the mid-1930s, well into the global Great Depression that was ravishing Harlem during Bonhoeffer's fellowship year. Bonhoeffer's practice of an incarnational ethic, which we've heard a lot of times thus already in the conference, with his notion of Christ as Stellvertreter, was a working part of his theology since his first dissertation, and it equipped him to enter into this evolving Harlem world as an engaged learner, even a participant through his relationship with his African-American friend, Frank Fisher. His theological practice of an incarnational ethics equipped him for that encounter, helping him to see the concrete needs for justice as they were perceived by the people within the communities gathered in Harlem. Here, this is the notion of Stellvertreter that's a little bit more than vicarious representative action. In vicarious representative action, a Stellvertreter is typically interpreted. One can represent somebody from a distance, but Bonhoeffer also meant it in an incarnational way. He's entering into the perspective of other people. This is what happens in Harlem. He enters into Harlem as an engaged learner. That incarnational practice thickened his interpretation of the way of Jesus and equipped him for the prophetic stance that he took in the confessing church. His desire for a pastorate in poor communities prior to the church struggle, his unique position early on as perhaps the only German theologian to argue that the Jewish question was, for Christians in Germany, the Christian problem, indeed a status confessionis for the church. His insistence on the importance of solidarity with those in suffering, and his claim in his 1933 Christology lectures that the proletariat Christians separate Christ from the constructs that the bourgeois church and its religion have confined him, can all be recognized, these few at least, can all be recognized as inspired by his Harlem World experiences, 1930-31. This paper will look at one aspect of his exposure to the Harlem Renaissance, his theological encounter with the race divide. I will examine this encounter by paying particular attention to Bonhoeffer's interaction with County Cullen's 1929 poem, The Black Christ, as a critical engagement with the race divide in American Christianity. His exposure to the race divide by virtue of his time in Harlem was a vital piece of Bonhoeffer's later politically inflected Christian witness in Germany. The Harlem Renaissance community gave to Bonhoeffer a unique perspective on the racial divide within American Christianity, allowing him to see the distortion that occurs with Christianity when it becomes blended with oppressive power structures. In Harlem, he caught some of what that community saw operating within the dominant white Christian worldview. From there, he observed a worldview nurturing a racial imagination that was in itself a diseased practice of Christian discipleship. Historically, the theology of that discipleship worked to legitimate white supremacy as the accepted God-given norm, shaping whites and blacks to be obedient disciples of its dictates. But in the Harlem Renaissance community, as Cullen's poem indicates, Bonhoeffer was exposed to a theological critique of race from within, as he put it, a rather hidden perspective. That perspective gave him insights into the theological ability of an oppressed people group to deflect popular harmful ideology. And that would be very important for the young Bonhoeffer after the Treaty of Versailles in an environment which he would describe as one where people would eat turnip and bread mixed with flour and sawdust, wearing clothes mixed with cloth and paper around town, when he would tell his story, oftentimes in New York, about the life in Germany after the Treaty of Versailles. A lengthier engagement with Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem would go further to unpack three important tropes that one can see in his writing and advocacy as a result of his Sloan Fellowship year. His interpretation of W.E.B. Du Bois' notion of the veil, the color line, and their respective roles in the further development of his interpretation of Martin Luther's notion of a theologia crucis, or theology of the cross. Briefly, in his end-of-the-year report to the Church Federation office, written at the end of his spring semester 1931, Bonhoeffer borrowed from Du Bois to describe some of what he learned during his brief sojourn as a Sloan Fellow. His description demonstrated some familiarity with this prominent Harlem Renaissance scholar when he said, "Here one gets to see something of the real face of America, something that is hidden behind the veil of words in the American Constitution saying that all men are created equal." The reference to the veil was clearly borrowed from Du Bois' seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. The veil is a construct that describes racialization. It is the forced attribution of racial identity by white folks upon black bodies that works like a projector screen. Du Bois argued that real black selves are hidden behind the veil. That is also the reason for double consciousness. Blacks know themselves as whites see them, in addition to their knowledge of their real black selves. In Souls, Du Bois described double consciousness and the veil as hermeneutical keys to the interpretation of the black-white encounter. This framework is vital to understand his theological critique of race. Du Bois claimed that the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. The color line is a power structure that belts the planet, subjugating people of color to whites-only power structures. It is reinforced by an abstract theology that gives theological support to an ideal humanity and places real life and social interaction in the column of adiaphora, or things indifferent. Bonhoeffer gained the ability to see that the color line is a Christian problem, and most importantly for what he was to face at home, to see how the color line passed through Germany in the form of die Judenfrage, or the Jewish question. We see his engagement with the color line in Germany at the very beginning of the church struggle. Bonhoeffer quickly rebuked his colleagues in the Pastors' Emergency League for their willingness to ignore what he saw was the heart of the problem with Nazi Christianity, Nazi Christians, their racism. Early in the church struggle, the majority of his colleagues viewed their conflict with the Nazi sympathizing German Christians much the same way that Martin Niemöller did. They resisted government intrusion in church affairs while remaining loyal to the Nazi government and viewed the Jewish question as adiaphora. The Jewish question was, for Niemöller, not a church issue, but it was the church issue for Bonhoeffer. Indeed, it was for Bonhoeffer a status confessionis, for the church. He rebuked his colleagues for their inability to see that the privilege of the Arians-only power structure in the church that they were willing to accept fundamentally changed the nature of Christian discipleship. The German Christians' demands destroy the substance of the ministry by making certain members of the Christian community into members with lesser rights, second-class Christians. The rest, those who remain privileged members, should prefer to stand by those with lesser rights, rather than to benefit from a privileged status in the church. They must see their own true service, which they can still perform for the church, in resigning from this office of pastor as privilege, which is now what it has become. Early in the struggle, Bonhoeffer stood alone in his opposition to what he described as fatal privilege, having come to recognize the color line that he saw from the hidden perspective of oppressed blacks in Harlem passing through Germany in the shape of the Jewish question. These two pieces, his interaction with the hermeneutical key of the black experience in America and his criticism of the color line in Germany, are important to the further development of his understanding of Luther's Theologia Crucis. This development is vital to our understanding of Bonhoeffer after New York, 1930-31. His language about the hiddenness of God deepened from a primary emphasis on Christ's hiddenness and our acceptance of grace bestowed upon Christians in ambivalence of Scripture. Christ hidden in the world in the lives of Christians who cannot be distinguished from non-Christians, to an emphasis on concrete obedience to Christ's commandments and dependence on costly grace. His insistence on costly grace was the fruit of this development. It is the result of an emphasis on the revelation of Christ, who is not hidden in our likeness to the world, which became understood as cheap grace. He came to insist on our solidarity with outcasts, where Christ is hidden in suffering. But that lengthier engagement will have to wait for another project. Here's a commercial for a book that's coming out soon. Here I will simply argue that it is the Christ hidden in suffering that Bonhoeffer came to see within the hidden perspective of Harlem. By exposure to the latent critique of the problem of race during the Harlem Renaissance, he wrote home regularly, describing what he was learning about the race problem in America. He was learning about the race-based division within American Christianity at a time when the notion of race was being critically analyzed in the proliferation of literature, music, theater, and art by African-American artists and intellectuals. He may have even personally met some of the prominent literary shapers of the Harlem Renaissance. In November of 1930, Frank Fisher brought his German friend with him to visit his alma mater, Howard College, now called Howard University in Washington, D.C. At the time of their visit, Alain Locke, the author whose monumental book, The New Negro, named the movement, was a very well-known faculty member of the college and the chair of its philosophy department. Dr. Locke and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois are still recognized as the two foremost intellectual architects of the New Negro movement. Of that visit to Howard with Fisher, Bonhoeffer claimed, "I was introduced not only to the leaders of the Young Negro movement, or New Negro movement, at Howard College in Washington, but also in Harlem, the Negro Quarter in New York. We know that he read some of Locke's and Du Bois's work along with other prominent Harlem Renaissance intellectuals in Niebuhr's spring course, and that he wrote an essay on the works of Harlem Renaissance writers whom he was voraciously studying, even apart from his assigned reading." That essay is now lost to us, but he describes it in a letter to Niebuhr in 1933. He also learned about the very public dispute between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois over the role that blacks must embrace for themselves in a white racist society. Washington's perspective was understood by some to be an old Negro type of black accommodation to white supremacy. From their perspective, Washington represented an assimilated white racist perspective of black people, one that was absorbed into a black self-perception and formed an internalized mandate for an inferior black existence. Du Bois had a different perspective. Bonhoeffer would have read the following when he read Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk. Mr. Washington represents in thought the old attitude of adjustment and submission. Mr. Washington's program practically accepts the alleged inferiority of the Negro races. Du Bois and his students rejected Washington's model of black engagement with white racism. Rather than adjustment and submission, Du Bois's model can be described as a resistance model of engagement with racism. The resistance model seems to have been attractive to the young Bonhoeffer. Regarding the conflict between Du Bois and Washington, Bonhoeffer said the following: Booker T. Washington preaches the gospel of working with regard to the white people separate like the fingers and one like the hand. This is a reference to Washington's famous Atlanta Compromise speech delivered in 1895. in which he encouraged blacks to accommodate a white racist worldview by accepting segregation and their second-class citizenship for the advancement of humankind. Bonhoeffer continued, Du Bois criticizes Washington sharply, accuses Washington to agree with the statement of inferiority of the black race, more race proud. His emphasis on Du Bois's race pride sounds as though he's affirming it. That's not surprising given what he came to learn about the reception of Washington's perspective within the communities of young participants in the Renaissance, among whom he was gathering friendships. Indeed, some interpreted black leaders who succumbed to this submission to racism perspective to be pawns of white racist leadership. Within the black community, at Abyssinian Baptist, in classes at Union, and on campus at Howard, Bonhoeffer would have learned that this perspective was particularly problematic for younger blacks. It was not only a social worldview, it housed a theological justification of racial inferiority that was leading young blacks away from Christianity because, as Bonhoeffer observed them to reason, it made their fathers meek in the face of their incomparably harsh fate. Christianity was, in their opinion, an opiate. We can see their theological critique of opiate religion in Cullen's The Black Christ, which Bonhoeffer referred to by name. Cullen was Du Bois' son-in-law. And it's most likely that Bonhoeffer encountered his work in that spring semester course with Niebuhr. He was the young Negro poet that Bonhoeffer was referring to when he commented on the racial condition of American Christianity. If it has come about that today the black Christ has to be led into the field against the white Christ by a young Negro poet, then a deep cleft in the Church of Jesus Christ is indicated. Bonhoeffer also referred to the black Christ with explicit reference to the American Christian problem of race. American Protestantism presents the image of a church torn by race. The severe destruction of the church is demonstrated by the fact that the white Christ is confronted by a black Christ. It is the guilt of the church that the ambitious young generation of African Americans turns away in general from the faith of the older ones with its strong eschatological tendencies. The strong eschatological tendencies that Bonhoeffer was referring to were the opiate features of oppressive religion that were being rejected by the younger blacks. Cullen's Black Christ was indicative of that rejecting process. It was a rejecting process performed in the context of a critical analysis of race and religion that was unique to the Harlem Renaissance. The Black Christ is representative of what James Cone describes as Harlem Renaissance lynching parables. The lynching parables were poems by black intellectuals of the Renaissance that placed Christ in the lived experience of race terror as a colored victim, to provide a theological critique of race and African American suffering in a white supremacist society. Their efforts can be understood by what womanist ethicist Emily Towns suggests as a distinction between suffering and pain. Towns references Audre Lorde when she describes suffering as cycles of inescapable, unscrutinized pain. Yet similar to what Du Bois describes as lifting the veil, when pain is highlighted, it becomes something different. It gets extracted from the undetermined, vicious, inescapable cycles and becomes an experience that is recognized, named, and can be used for transformation. Hence, our responsibility in the face of human suffering is to resist it by moving from suffering to pain. Pain, as Towns describes it, is a constituent of the struggle against injustice. We may interpret the goal of the lynching parables in this light. They represent critical theological analyses by Harlem Renaissance intellectuals of religion and black suffering in an effort to move from suffering to pain. Du Bois also wrote numerous lynching parables. One in particular placed a Jewish Jesus in Waco, Texas, where I live right now, to be encountered by pious Christian whites who were aghast at his colored appearance to the point that he is lynched. Jesus Christ in Texas represented the color line as an ironic Christological tragedy. In a white-centered world, the Son of God becomes a frightening disruption. Simply one more inhabitant of the racialized communities that are intimately familiar with white Christian scorn. They are the people Howard Thurman described as the disinherited, until white Christians come to recognize Christ's natural physical identification with the subjugated and the disinherited who comprise the populations on the unfavorable side of the color line. That Cullen's poem is also this kind of critical engagement with race is indicated by the audience to whom Cullen dedicates it, hopefully dedicated to white America. In the poem, the historical Jesus becomes the first lynched victim of an evil mob in a succession of lynched victims that includes African Americans. How Calvary in Palestine, extending down to me and mine, was but the first leaf in a line of trees on which a man should swing, world without end in suffering. The poem consists of three main characters: a Job-like pious Christian mother, and her two young adult sons, who function in a role that resembles Job's accusatory friends. Both of these young men, the younger one named Jim and the older unnamed brother, wrestle with questions of theodicy. Since his childhood, Jim has doubted the existence of God because of white cruelty and innocent suffering. A man was lynched last night. Why? Jim would ask, his eyes star-bright. A white man struck him. He showed fight. Maybe God thinks such things are right. Maybe God never thinks at all of us. And Jim would clench his small, hard fingers tight into a ball. Likely there ain't no God at all. God could not be, if he deemed right, the grief that ever met our sight. Initially, this language used in conversation about God is problematic for the older brother. He's introduced as being friendly towards the religion of his mother, but we soon learn of his growing concern for the safety of his smart, handsome younger brother. That concern leads to bitter words of fear and anguish over the role of God in black suffering. Why is it dangerous for Jim, the younger brother, to exist as an intelligent, handsome, and self-confident black man? This gets to the theological critique in Cullen's depiction of race. It is the problem of discipleship and obedience within a racialized structure of Christianity, and a vital insight on the intersection of race, religion, and oppression in white power structures. This perspective would have proven enlightening for Bonhoeffer. From this viewpoint, he saw white Christians turn Christ into the representative of white cultural longing, a fetish of idealized humanity. That Christ was not a guide for daily interaction with one's real neighbor, not one who has commanded that we must do unto others as we would have them do to us. He had become a policeman on the borders of white racial identity and a theological justification for dehumanizing real people in the name of an ideal Christian community. Discipleship had become training in hatred. That was the white Christ that Bonhoeffer was referring to in his letters home that year. That Christ was the source of cheap grace active within the fatal privilege he was protesting in the church struggle, and was also the repellent within the Christianity that he noticed younger blacks turning away from in Harlem. Jim represents this youthful resistance model of race critique within the Harlem Renaissance: proud, intelligent, good-looking, and no longer silent. He strikes an assaultive white racist man, resulting in Jim's death by lynching at the hands of an angry white mob at his home in front of his mother and brother. At this, his elder brother is devastated. The elder brother's emotional state is exaggerated by the sight of his mother on her knees in prayer to white Christ. "Call on him now," I mocked, "and try your faith against his deed, while I, with intent equally as sane, searching a motive for this pain, will hold a little stone on high and seek of it a reason why. Which, stone or God, will first reply? What has he done for you who spent a bleeding life for his content? Or is white Christ too distraught by these dark skins his father wrought? The white Christ does nothing for their family's well-being. He hurts, humiliates, and kills them. But here is the heart of Cullen's critique. The religion of the pious black Christian mother has nothing to do with the religious representation of white racism. She is not praying to a white Christ. The Christ she worships betrays the lethal nature of the mixture of race terror and Christianity that white racist Christians force society to drink. That mixture is lethal for victims and perpetrators alike. Her faith in Christ extracts him from that lethal concoction and disassociates him from the structures that fail to acknowledge his life in solidarity with the oppressed. Her Jesus is very different from the Christ who is co-opted by forces that turn him into a weapon wielded against marginalized people. With her, Jesus becomes a contradiction to the way in which white racist Christians construct society. Her Jesus cannot be found in the domination and race-based privileges of racialized communities. She knows that Christ is hidden from racists in and amongst their victims, with those whom Bonhoeffer in his Ethics would later describe as the poorest of our brothers and sisters. Indeed, Christ was hidden even from her own son, who did not know that Jesus was there among them until he came to recognize him in his brother's suffering. That is the poem's admonition to us. Only at that recognition did the elder brother come to know Christ and proclaim him as the form immaculately born, betrayed 1,000 times each morn, as many times each night denied, surrendered, tortured, crucified. Cullen's black Christ exists in solidarity with this suffering black family. Indeed, he is one of them. Understanding Jesus in this way, as one who is intimately participating in the lives of suffering and marginalized people, has significant implications for Christian discipleship. Christ entering into the suffering of the outcasts and marginalized is a theme that resonates with Bonhoeffer's Christology. When he returns to Germany, we see that Bonhoeffer not only agreed with this Christological theme as a mode of Christ's existence in the world, but also as the ethical imperative for real Christian discipleship. It is the form of Christ-centered Christianity that Bonhoeffer saw expressed with zeal at Abyssinian Baptist. I heard the gospel preached in Negro churches. Here one could still hear someone talk in a Christian sense about sin and grace and the love of God and ultimate hope, albeit in a form different from the way to which we are accustomed. In contrast to the often lecture-like character of the white Christ, the black Christ is preached with captivating passion and vividness. The captivating passion of the black Christ was invigorating and a source through which he came to identify with African Americans in the spirituals which he loved so much that spoke of grace and suffering, and in their theology. One Sunday morning during that spring semester of 1931, one of Bonhoeffer's fellow students, Miles Horton, observed Bonhoeffer returning to his seminary lodging from Abyssinian Baptist, where he had become a lay leader with his friend Frank Fisher. After teaching Sunday school that day, Bonhoeffer lingered for a time, excited to talk about that day at church. To Horton's surprise, Bonhoeffer was quite emotional. This was out of character for Bonhoeffer's typically logical, unemotive temperament. Horton remembered Bonhoeffer claiming that the only time he had experienced true religion in the United States was in black churches. And he was convinced that it was only among blacks who were oppressed that there could be any real religion in this country. As Horton later recalled, perhaps that Sunday afternoon, I witnessed a beginning of his identification with the oppressed, which played a role in the decision that led to his death. Indeed, Horton was right. Bonhoeffer's identification with the resistance model of Christ, who knew and accepted suffering in America, placed him in solidarity with the outcast and the marginalized in Germany. It led him to drink the full measure of the cup of Christ's suffering, like the lynching parables of the Harlem Renaissance described it, at the gallows at Flossenburg concentration camp in the morning hours of April 9th, 1945. One last piece. This is another one of Aaron Douglas's paintings. In this painting, I actually grew up with this understanding of Christ's walk to Gethsemane. I'm sorry, Christ's walk to the Golgotha. I said Gethsemane. Christ's walk to Golgotha. This is, in this picture, people usually are drawn right here, of course, and assume that that's Christ. But there's Jesus. That's Simon. That's Black Simon. That when Simon picked up the cross, the tradition goes that Simon was an African. And by picking up that cross, we picked up the sufferings of Jesus. Black Jesus, or an association with the sufferings of Jesus. This was a tradition that he would have picked up in, and what the Black Christ also points to. So thank you for listening. Back up.
You want to just field your own questions? Do you need me up here?
I can field them. Sure.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We have 15 minutes for question and answer, so I invite you to come to the microphones in the aisles and state your question plainly and forthrightly, and Dr. Williams will be happy to answer them.
My name is Modesto, and I want to thank you for your lecture, Dr. Williams. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question is, when you look at Bonhoeffer and he goes to New York and his experience there with the Black church, I see in him no hesitation to go there in respect to the issue of suffering. And I see in the church as a whole, I'm not just talking about the white church, the Hispanic church, I see that when we make it, whatever culture you're talking about, it refuses to go there. I do a lot of inner city work, or ministry rather, and I see this, that even when people make it, the African American, the Hispanic, the white, the Anglo, they don't want to go there. And this is what I find amazing in Bonhoeffer, especially he's a German theologian. He's coming out of a cultured family and whatnot, and he had never experienced it. And his willingness to go there, even though it was a shock to him, it just amazes me. But the question is, how do we get the church to be willing to go there in his regards to poverty, suffering, social justice, and those issues, and get us off our little comfortable zones?
That's a great question. That's a great question. Another way of phrasing the question is, was your Christ crucified? How do you understand Jesus? Is he a ticket to a wealthy life? Or do you know that your Savior was crucified? I think that's also a way of looking at the question. So if we serve and we worship a crucified and risen Savior, what is our role in the suffering that is present in the world around us? Do we ignore it? Can we ignore suffering and worship a crucified and risen Savior? So, yes.
I really want to thank you for your talk. Over the past few years, I've struggled with understanding what's the point of Black History Month, being a white male. It's always been, why 1 month dedicated to the blacks? I never understood it, and the struggle of that. And over the past few years, just realizing, wow, my deep racism that I had veiled. And I had to cry with a few of my friends because of that. But so I really appreciate the perspective that you brought. I just wanted to tell you thank you for that.
Thank you.
2 questions. How can we surpass or look beyond a colored Christ? When I say colored, I mean of any color.
Sure.
So is there a unified Christ for us all? And how does your lecture then apply to the sufferings of the blacks today?
Right. The unified Christ thing, one of the things that I teach a course on race and racism, and one of the things this notion of a unified Christ might get to, there are 2 ways to think about this. One, the notion of a colorblind society is a dangerous one. Colorblindness is a way of ignoring the racialized society in which we have, and it enshrines really a white worldview as the norm. It goes as the unexamined norm within society. The way that humanity is shaped since modernity is racialized. So we have to know the place in which, we got to know the environment in which we live to be able to talk about how to get out of this mess. So first of all, to understand that humanity as we understand it since modernity, the whole Western world, humanity it's a fabricated notion. Getting behind the veil is really like getting outside of the world created in the Truman Show. And those of you who've seen the movie Truman Show, he doesn't know that he's in a world that's all made up. So lifting the veil is getting behind that and seeing the real world as it exists. This is something that Bonhoeffer helps us with. He says in Life Together, God hates visionary dreamers. And in some of the lectures that we've been listening to, there's language of, and especially in ethics, living a good life, knowing right and wrong in that sense, is not what a Christian life is about. That's not what a Christian life is about. A Christian life is about obedience. And when you get to know these principles or so forth, before you encounter real life, that is a failure to engage life as it approaches you, right? This notion of real life, not as good living that you can figure out before you encounter people, but life as a person. Real life as a person. Jesus is life. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right. Life does not exist apart from this I who comes to me in the person of the other, real world, not an idealized humanity. So the notion of race as an ideal humanity is a failure to engage the real life of the person who comes towards me in Christ, knowing my brother and my sister as they are, not as race describes them to me. So the language of a universe, it would have to be able to engage real life. Okay. Knowing myself in this world outside of the racialized structures that describe humanity to me.
Okay. And the second question being on how your talk can be applied to the current struggle of the blacks in America or even the world.
I think of that as the understanding of, and this is my overall project in Christian ethics, is to recalibrate how we understand humanity since modernity. Bonhoeffer helps to tell that story. So what Bonhoeffer does, the language of self-retraiting is the shape of his Christology. Some might call it, they like the language of empathic interaction with each other. So humanity shaped in modernity is an ideal that is it's a deductive reasoning. It's top down. We impose this on people, right? This is what race does. But an inductive engagement is the real world bottom up engagement with each other. I think that rather than assuming or dealing with knowledge in this deductive manner, engaging with each other in the real world is, some might call it empathy as a better universal, empathic learning. Willie Jennings in his book, The Christian Imagination, says, the natural inclination of the gospel is intimacy and hospitality and joining with each other. So instead of building walls and lobbing bombs, how about we take those walls down and we engage each other in the real world? I don't know if that answers your question, but sure.
Hi, Charles Marsh, University of Virginia.
Goodness.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I learned so much, and
Wow.
I'm very grateful. When's your book coming out?
I'm hoping soon.
Okay.
But I'm hoping soon. You and I should probably talk.
Thank you.
Right.
I just have a real quick question. If you answer no or I don't know to these three questions, it will in no way diminish the brilliance of your lecture. These are questions that are probably purely selfish, but they have to do with possible discoveries.
Honored.
Did you find in your research, number one, any accounts of former Abyssinian parishioners of Bonhoeffer's 6 months in Harlem? The second question is, do you know of any correspondence between Frank Fisher and Bonhoeffer after Union? Did Frank Fisher ever make any comments do you have any materials or papers? I know he pastored the West Hunter Baptist Church in Atlanta until his death in 1960. Find anything about that? And then you may know that there was a claim in a dissertation.
Yes.
The person that make it here.
Ralph Klingons, right.
That the term cheap grace,
Right.
Bonhoeffer heard in an Adam Clayton Powell senior sermon. Just your response to any of those.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely, yeah. I know of that dissertation that's now a little pamphlet. And funny story, I went to, and I don't mean to denigrate him, just a little bit of background because you bring it up, but when I went to do my research in Harlem, I stayed with a family who I've become very close friends with now. There's a deacon and a deaconess from Abyssinian Baptist, and I did research there and at Union, walking the walk that I assumed Bonhoeffer would take back and forth from Harlem to Union. I forgot my book, that little book. I was so excited to look up the sermons and find these words. So I forgot my book, and I found him. And I spoke to him. He said, can you do me a favor and do some research on sermons from this time period to back up, kind of what I was saying in that. Like, what? So in other words, there was no evidence that Bonhoeffer actually said those words. That Adam Clayton Powell said those words. No evidence of that. There was some inferences from sermons that he did say. There was one called A Model Church that Powell preached a number of times and turned into a pamphlet that was there when Bonhoeffer was there, in which he claims that he's talking about saving grace. He says the best description of saving grace that he's read in the Gospels, Powell's saying this, comes from the mother of Jesus at Cana of Galilee when the water was turned to wine. Whatsoever he says to you, do it. This claim, these words would have been shocking for the Bonhoeffer who was saying some stuff about inactivity in faith before that. I became friends with Frank Fisher's family while I was doing my dissertation. In fact, his daughter let me know that Bonhoeffer had given her father a book in a gift exchange over Christmas. Now, folks knew that Bonhoeffer received a book from Frank Fisher. They thought it happened at the end of his year in 1930-31 as a parting gift. But this book, when we found this book, found that it was actually not the end of the year. It was in Christmas of 1930 before Bonhoeffer went to Cuba. It was a gift exchange. She had a book from Bonhoeffer to her dad, sitting in a piano bench in her living room. It was about German architecture, with an inscription in it, to my dear friend Frank Fisher, Christmas 1930. She gave me the book. I was shocked. Came into my mailbox in a white trash bag in a box, paper box. It was wild. So it's now in the Union archives. I opened the thing up and saw this inscription, and I felt like Gollum, my precious. Yeah. So, but also in that encounter, what I learned was that when Frank Fisher died, Fisher's daughter found that book in the trash. Her mother went and threw away a lot of her father's stuff. She's sure that there was correspondence between Bonhoeffer and Fisher that she didn't retrieve. Could have had that. I could have had it. Sure.
Well, Dr. Williams, thank you for telling this story for us. I guess my question is a little bit about how we tell the story of Bonhoeffer.
Yeah.
And thinking, I'm no scholar and haven't read that many things about him, but when I hear this story, often this chapter, I hear he goes to New York, I hear he's been in Harlem. That's maybe the extent of it. So the question is, what do we lose by skipping over this chapter in Bonhoeffer's life? And on the flip side, what do we gain from really uncovering this larger story?
A lot of what we gain, Dr. Marsh, I'm sure his book will also point at that. A lot of what we gain by understanding what happens in New York for Bonhoeffer is the point at which he changes, turns from the phraseology, as he says, to the real. Bonhoeffer was primarily, as he understood, a dogmatic theologian. Very, very brilliant theologian who had done 2 dissertations by his 23rd birthday. Right? He comes to New York as a wonderful theologian wanting to understand how theology is formed in completely different contexts. This is what he says. He heads into Harlem, and this is vital. What he does, now, let me back up and set the stage here in a little different way as well. I've already discussed how Germany was really poor, right? And they were also not doing well with after the Versailles peace treaty. The conditions were right for Hitler's rise, with all this poor and anger and so forth. And he, though he was privileged, could tell stories of meals on turnips and bread mixed with sawdust and so forth, and flour, and lots of suicides and so on. A dear friend, Willie Jennings from Duke, has a book called The Christian Imagination. In this book, The Christian Imagination, is a chapter on Olaudah Equiano, slave, who, after he bought his freedom, wrote a book about his story. The middle passage is particularly hard to read, where slaves enter the boat, introduced to Christianity. If you've seen Amistad, the movie Amistad, there is that picture of the middle passage that Cinque describes when he's on trial. Well, they enter and they are chained side by side. Very many of them do not survive the middle passage. It's brutal. Murder, death by whipping, torture, killing. They are introduced to the notion of race on the slave boat. Before they enter the slave boat, they are not black. They are their particular tribe. The geography is a part of their identity. They're not black people. They enter modernity. They enter European world of Christianity and identity as black people on that boat. And on the Atlantic, where there is a triangle, the slave trade is a triangle heading off to South America, the colonies, America and England. That black Atlantic is a rhizomorphic structure of black cultures, splintered off in many different languages and directions as a result of this race description here. Bonhoeffer, moving from Germany to Harlem, figuratively enters this black Atlantic, sails across from Germany in this black Atlantic and experiences identity and religion from that perspective. That perspective is crucial when he gets back to Germany and they're talking Herrenvolk, master race language. They're talking Volksgeist, people spirit, state spirit, or race language, master race language. Nobody else understood. I mean, most folks recognize he was the first one, the only one, very early on to recognize that as a Christian problem. There. Oh, we are out of time. Okay.
Regrettably. Yep.